I always wondered why I was the only one in my family with green eyes. Turns out some questions are better left unanswered because the DNA test that was supposed to bring us closer together ended up tearing my entire family apart. My name is Sarah, and I'm 28 years old. For most of my life, I believed I had the perfect family. My parents, Linda and Robert, had been married for 32 years when this all went down. They were high school sweethearts, one of those couples that everyone looks at and thinks, goals. They met when they were 16, got married right after graduation, and had me 2 years later. Growing up in suburban Denver, our house was the one all the neighborhood kids wanted to hang out at. Mom always had fresh cookies in the oven, and Dad was the type who'd de-drop everything to help you with homework or teach you how to throw a curveball. Every Friday night was family movie night, complete with homemade popcorn and Dad's terrible impersonations of the actors. Sundays meant pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse heads and long drives through the mountains. My parents seemed genuinely happy. They still held hands walking through the grocery store, still laughed at each other's jokes, even after hearing them 1,000 times. Dad would leave little notes in Mom's lunch, and she'd blush like a teenager whenever she found them. They had their own language, inside jokes, meaningful glances across crowded rooms. The way they could communicate entire conversations with just their eyebrows. But there was always this one thing that nagged at me, this tiny splinter in my otherwise perfect family portrait.
Oh.
I looked absolutely nothing like either of them, not even close. My parents are both what you'd call classically German-American. Dad's got sandy brown hair that's now mostly gray, blue eyes, and fair skin that burns if he even thinks about the sun. Mom has that same Northern European look blonde hair she's been dyeing the same shade for 20 years. Pale blue eyes, and the kind of complexion that makeup artists call porcelain. And then there's me. Dark brown hair so thick my hairdresser complains every time I come in for a cut. Olive skin that tans beautifully and never burns. And those green eyes, not just green, but this intense emerald green that people always comment on. Wow, where did those eyes come from? I'd ask, looking back and forth between me and my parents with barely concealed confusion. My parents had their standard response down pat. Sarah got the recessive genes, Mom would say with a laugh. My grandmother on my mother's side had darker coloring. Dad would nod along, adding, genetics are funny like that. You never know what combination you'll get. I accepted this explanation because, honestly, what else was I supposed to do? These were my parents. They loved me. They raised me. They were there for every scraped knee, every broken heart, every triumph and disappointment. When I made the honor roll, Dad would frame the certificate and hang it on his office wall. When I had my wisdom teeth out, Mom slept on the floor next to my bed for 3 nights to make sure I was okay. But as I got older, the questions became harder to ignore. In high school biology, we did this unit on genetics and heredity. I remember sitting there, looking at those Punnett squares, trying to figure out how the blue-eyed parents could have a green-eyed kid. My teacher, Mr. Peterson, explained that it was technically possible but extremely rare. The odds are less than 1%, he said, not knowing he was talking about me specifically. College brought more questions. I studied abroad in Italy during my junior year and was constantly mistaken for a local. People would start conversations with me in rapid Italian, assuming I was just another Roman girl. Meanwhile, my parents had visited Ireland the summer before and sent me pictures of themselves looking like lobsters after 2 hours in the Dublin sun. The weirdest part was medical history. Every time I went to a new doctor, they'd ask about family medical history, heart disease, cancer, diabetes. I'd dutifully report my parents' clean bills of health, but something always felt off. The doctors would look at me strangely when I mentioned that neither parent had ever had so much as high blood pressure, especially when they were running tests on me for things that seemed to have no family precedent. My friends started noticing too. In college, my roommate Jessica was studying photography and wanted to do a project on family resemblances. She took pictures of me with my parents during a family weekend, then spent hours trying to find any similarity. "I'm sorry," she finally said, "but are you sure you're not adopted?" The question hit me like a slap. Adopted, that had never even occurred to me. My parents had photo albums full of pregnancy pictures, hospital bracelets from the day I was born, even a lock of my newborn hair. There were pictures of Mom's belly growing bigger each month, Dad's proud face in the delivery room, The three of us as a new family. But Jessica's question planted a seed that grew into something I couldn't ignore. I started really looking at myself in the mirror, then at family photos. I studied my features with the intensity of a detective. The nose, the jawline, the shape of my eyes, nothing matched, not even close. I tried to push these thoughts away. I had a good relationship with my parents. We talked almost every day, spent holidays together, supported each other through life's ups and downs. Mom had been my maid of honor when I married David 3 years earlier. Dad walked me down the aisle with tears streaming down his face. These were my parents in every way that mattered. But the questions wouldn't stop coming, and neither would that nagging feeling that something in my family story didn't quite add up. The real turning point came during Christmas dinner last year. We were all gathered around Mom's dining room table, the same one where I'd done homework, eaten countless meals, and blown out birthday candles for 28 years. The conversation was flowing like wine, everyone catching up and sharing stories from the past year. My cousin Jennifer had brought her new boyfriend Mark, who was meeting the extended family for the first time. He was one of those naturally curious people who ask lots of questions. Where did you grow up? What do you do for work? How are you related to Jennifer? Normal get-to-know-you conversation. But then he turned to me and said something that made the entire table go quiet. Sarah, forgive me if this is rude, but you look so different from everyone else here. Are you adopted, or maybe from a different part of the family tree? The silence was deafening. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even my 5-year-old nephew seemed to sense that something heavy had just landed in the room. Mom's face went completely white. Dad started clearing his throat nervously, the way he always did when he was uncomfortable. Oh, genetics are just funny like that, Dad said, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. Sarah got some recessive genes from way back. But Mark, bless his heart, wasn't satisfied with that answer. It's just so striking, he continued, oblivious to the tension he'd created. I mean, look around this table. Everyone else has those Nordic features, the light hair, light eyes, fair skin. Sarah looks like she could be from a completely different ethnic background. It's actually really beautiful, the contrast. Jennifer elbowed him to stop talking, but the damage was already done. The elephant that had been sitting quietly in the corner of our family room for 28 years had just stood up and announced itself to everyone present. After that dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about Mark's observation. He was right, and everyone knew it. I started paying more attention to family gatherings, really looking at the genetic patterns. My dad's sister had 3 kids, all with that same sandy brown hair and blue eyes. Mom's brother had 2 daughters who could have been her clones at their age. And then there was me, looking like I'd wandered in from a different family entirely. The questions that had been whispers in my head became shouts I couldn't ignore. I started doing what any millennial does when they need answers. I went down a Google rabbit hole. I researched genetics, heredity patterns, the likelihood of certain combinations. What I found was unencouraging for the recessive genes theory my parents had been pushing my entire life. I learned that green eyes are incredibly rare to begin with. Only about 2% of the population has them. For 2 blue-eyed parents to have a green-eyed child, there would need to be some seriously specific genetic circumstances. It's not impossible, but highly, highly unlikely. Then I started thinking about other things. Personality traits, for instance. My parents are both quiet, reserved people. They like routine, stability, predictable pleasures. Dad's idea of adventure is trying a new restaurant. Mom's biggest rebellion is staying up past 10 o'clock on a weeknight. I've always been the opposite. I'm loud, spontaneous, constantly seeking new experiences. I backpacked through Europe solo after college, something that terrified my parents, but felt completely natural to me. I switched majors 3 times, moved to 5 different cities before settling down. And I've always felt this pull toward travel and adventure that neither of my parents has ever understood. Get that from your great-aunt Margaret, Mom would say, when I'd announce another impulsive life change. But I'd never met great-aunt Margaret, and somehow that explanation never quite satisfied me either. The more I thought about it, the more questions bubbled up. Medical things started making sense in a different way. I'd always had this weird reaction to certain medications that neither of my parents experienced. My blood type is O-negative, which seemed odd given what I knew about my parents' blood types. Little things that I'd never connected before started forming a pattern, but the real moment of truth came when I was going through some old family photos with Mom a few weeks after Christmas. We were putting together a scrapbook for Dad's 60th birthday. I was looking through boxes of pictures I'd never seen before. Most of them were exactly what you'd expect: baby photos, school pictures, family vacations. But then I found a stack of photos from what looked like Mom's pregnancy with me. Hospital shots, her holding me as a newborn, the typical proud new parent collection. Something felt off about these pictures, but I couldn't put my finger on what. The lighting seemed different, the quality wasn't quite right. And then I noticed something that made my stomach drop in one of the pictures of Mom, supposedly holding newborn me. She was wearing a watch that I knew for a fact she had unowned until I was in elementary school. I remembered when she got that watch because it was an anniversary gift from Dad for their 15th wedding anniversary. I was born on their second anniversary. The math didn't add up. And suddenly I was looking at these photos with completely different eyes. The baby in the pictures looked like me, but the timeline was all wrong. Either these photos were taken much later than they were supposed to be, or something else was going on that I didn't understand. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider. What if the adoption theory wasn't so crazy after all? What if there was a reason I looked so different, felt so different, seemed to come from somewhere else entirely? The questions that had been building for years finally reached a breaking point. I needed answers, and I knew there was only one way to get them that would settle this once and for all. It was time for a DNA test. The decision to get a DNA test wasn't made lightly. For weeks after finding those photos, I carried this secret weight around with me. I'd catch myself staring at my reflection in store windows, looking for any trace of my parents in my features. I'd study family photos with the intensity of a forensic investigator, searching for clues I might have missed. David, my husband, was the first person I confided in. We were lying in bed one night when I finally broke down and told him everything: the Christmas dinner comment, the strange photos, the years of feeling like I didn't quite belong in my own family tree. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently, stroking my hair as I laid my head on his chest. "I think I need to know for sure," I whispered. "I think I need to take a DNA test." David was quiet for a long moment. He knew how much I loved my parents, how close our family was. He understood that this wasn't about wanting different parents or being unhappy with the ones I had. This was about needing to understand my own story. "That's what you need to do? I'll support you," he said finally. "But are you prepared for whatever you might find out?" That question haunted me for days. Was I prepared? What if my suspicions were wrong, and I was about to cause a family crisis over nothing? God. What if they were right and everything I thought I knew about my origins was a lie? I decided to start small. Instead of confronting my parents directly, I ordered one of those Ancestry DNA kits online. You know, the ones they promise to tell you your ethnic breakdown? Connect you with distant relatives, maybe help you build a family tree. Seemed innocent enough, just curious about my heritage. When the package arrived, I stared at it for 3 days before working up the courage to open it. Such a simple thing, just a plastic tube and some instructions, but it felt like I was holding a bomb that could explode my entire life. The process was straightforward. Spit in the tube, seal it up, mail it back, 4 to 6 weeks for results. Easy as ordering a pizza, except the stakes were infinitely higher. Those 4 weeks were torture. Found myself checking my email obsessively, jumping every time my phone buzzed. I started researching what the results might tell me. If I really was my parents' biological child, my DNA would show primarily Northern European heritage German. Maybe some British Isles, possibly Scandinavian. That's what my family tree suggested, what my parents had always told me about our ancestry. But I had a feeling that wasn't what I was going to find. I didn't tell my parents about the test. How do you bring that up in conversation? "Hey, Mom, I'm questioning my entire genetic identity because I think you might have been lying to me for 28 years. There was no good way to approach it, so I kept it to myself. The waiting was the hardest part. I found myself paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. The way Mom got nervous when ancestry or genetics came up in conversation.
Ow.
Dad would quickly change the subject if anyone mentioned family resemblances. Little behaviors that might have been perfectly normal, or might have been signs of a secret they'd been keeping for decades. I started having dreams about the results. Sometimes they'd show exactly what I expected, that I was 100% Northern European, perfectly matching my parents' ancestry, proving that I'd been paranoid and suspicious for no reason. Other times, The dreams would reveal something completely different, that I was adopted, or that one of my parents wasn't actually my biological parent, or some other family secret that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about myself. The rational part of my mind kept trying to talk me out of this investigation. My parents were good people who loved me. They'd given me a wonderful childhood, supported me through college, been there for every major life event. Did it really matter if we shared DNA? Weren't love and commitment more important than biology? But the other part of my mind, the part that had been asking questions for years, wouldn't let it go. I needed to know. Not because I wanted different parents, but because I needed to understand my own story. Who was I really? Where did I come from? Why did I look the way I did, act the way I did, feel so different from the people who raised me? As the weeks passed, I started preparing myself for different scenarios. If the test confirmed that I was my parents' biological child, I'd have to accept that genetics really were just strange sometimes. I'd have to make peace with being the genetic outlier in my family and stop questioning something that didn't need questioning. But if the test showed something else, I'd have to figure out how to handle what might be the biggest family secret of my lifetime. Would I confront my parents? Would I tell them about the test? Would I try to find out more about my biological origins, or would I let sleeping dogs lie? I made David promise that no matter what the results showed, he'd help me handle them responsibly. I didn't want to destroy my family over curiosity, but we also couldn't continue living with these unanswered questions, eating away at me. Finally, on a Tuesday morning in March, the email arrived. Your DNA results are ready. 5 simple words that would either put my mind at ease or turn my world completely upside down. I was at work when I got the notification, but there was no way I could wait until I got home to check. I locked my office door, took a deep breath, and clicked the link. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my parents, and myself. And it was just the beginning of a journey that would ultimately tear apart the family I'd always thought was perfect. I remember exactly where I was sitting when I opened those results. My office chair, the one with the squeaky left armrest, facing my computer screen with my back to the door I'd just locked. My hands were actually shaking as I logged into the website. I had to type my password 3 times because I kept making mistakes. The page loaded slowly, or maybe time was just moving differently for me in that moment. First came the ethnic breakdown, displayed in a colorful pie chart that looked nothing like what I'd been expecting my entire life. 43% Italian, 26% Greek, 15% Middle Eastern, Iberian Peninsula, 5% North African, 3% broadly Sub-Saharan African, 0% German, 0% British, 0% Scandinavian, 0% of anything that should have connected me to the parents who raised me. I stared at that screen until my eyes burned, convinced there had to be some kind of mistake. I refreshed the page, logged out and back in, even checked to make sure I was looking at the right account. But the results didn't change. According to this test, I wasn't just genetically different from my parents. I was from completely different continents. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. I scrolled down to the relative matches section, expecting to find maybe some distant cousins. People so far removed from my family tree that they wouldn't mean anything significant. Instead, I found something that made my heart stop completely. Listed as my closest match, with the relationship parent-child and 49.8% DNA shared, was someone named Anthony Martinelli. I had a biological father, and it wasn't Robert, the man who'd raised me, taught me to ride a bike, and walked me down the aisle at my wedding. My finger hovered over Anthony's profile link for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. Did I really want to open this door? Did I want to know who this person was, what his story might be, why I'd never heard his name before in my life? I clicked. Anthony Martinelli, 58 years old, living in Phoenix, Arizona. His profile picture showed a man with dark hair that was graying at the temples, olive skin, and those same green eyes I'd been staring at in mirrors my whole life. It was like looking at a male version of myself, or what I might look like in 30 years. According to his public profile information, he'd been using the DNA site to research his Italian family history. He had 2 other children, listed a son and daughter from his marriage to someone named Rosa Martinelli. There was no mention of a 3rd child, no indication that he even knew I existed. I sat in my office for the rest of the afternoon, alternating between staring at Anthony's profile and trying to process what this meant for my entire life story. My parents, Linda and Robert, the people who'd raised me, loved me, and given me everything, had been lying to me for 28 years. It's not just a small lie, not just fudging some details, but a complete fabrication about my origins. The implications were staggering. If Robert wasn't my biological father, that meant that either I was adopted, and they'd never told me, or Mom had had an affair, and they'd been covering it up my entire life. Given that I'd found pregnancy photos and hospital records, adoption seemed less likely, which left the affair scenario. My mother, sweet, quiet, would never hurt a fly, Linda had apparently had a relationship with Anthony Martinelli around the time I was conceived. And then she and Dad had made the decision to raise me as their own biological child, never telling me the truth about where I really came from. I thought about all those years of questions, all those times I'd felt different and out of place, all those moments when I'd asked about my appearance and they'd given me that standard line about recessive genes and distant relatives. They'd known the whole time why I looked different, why I didn't fit the family mold, why I seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Not just hurt, but genuinely furious. I understood why they might have made certain choices when I was born. Affairs happen. Families get complicated. People do what they think is best in difficult situations. But to lie to me for nearly 3 decades, to let me question my own identity, to make me feel like there was something wrong with me for not resembling my family, that felt unforgivable. I screenshot everything: Anthony's profile, the DNA breakdown, the relationship percentages, and sent them to David with a message that just said, "Call me now." He picked up on the first ring. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "You sound..." The DNA results came back, I interrupted. "Robert isn't my biological father." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, "Are you sure?" "I'm looking at a 49.8% DNA match with someone named Anthony Martinelli. The site lists our relationship as parent-child." "I'm sure, David. I'm completely sure." "Oh, honey," he said softly. "I'm so sorry. Are you okay? Do you want me to come home?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know anything right now. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, about my parents, it's all been a lie." We talked for another 20 minutes. David trying to help me process this information, me alternating between crying and raging about the deception. Finally, he convinced me to come home early, to take some time to digest this information before deciding what to do next. But as I drove home that afternoon, one thing became crystal clear. I couldn't pretend I didn't know this information. I couldn't go back to family dinners and casual conversations knowing what I now knew about my origins. I was going to have to confront my parents, and that conversation was going to change our relationship forever. I waited 3 days before calling my parents. 3 days of barely sleeping, of David and I having the same circular conversations about how to handle this revelation, of me staring at Anthony Martinelli's profile picture and trying to see my own future in his face. Finally, on Friday evening, I called Mom and asked if I could come over the next day. "Just need to talk to you and Dad about something," I said, trying to keep my voice normal. She must have heard something in my tone because she asked twice if everything was okay, but I just told her we'd talk tomorrow. I spent Saturday morning rehearsing different versions of this conversation in my head. How do you tell your parents that you know their biggest secret? How do you ask your mother if she had an affair without destroying everyone in the process? There was no script for this situation, no gentle way to detonate a nuclear bomb in the middle of a family. When I arrived at their house, they were both in the living room waiting for me. Mom had made coffee and put out a plate of cookies, the same chocolate chip ones she'd been making since I was a kid. The normalcy of it all made what I was about to do feel even more surreal. "So what did you want to talk about, sweetheart?" Dad asked, as I sat down in the chair across from them. They were holding hands on the couch, presenting a united front without even knowing they needed to. I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshot of my DNA results. My hands were shaking as I turned the screen toward them. "I took a DNA test," I said simply, "and I found out that Robert isn't my biological father." The silence that followed was deafening. Mom's face went completely white, then flushed red, then white again. Dad's mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. The plate of cookies sat untouched between us, a symbol of the normal family dynamic that was about to be shattered completely. Mom was the first to speak. "Sarah, honey, she started, then stopped. looking at Dad desperately. You knew, I said, and it wasn't a question. You both knew, and you've been lying to me for 28 years. Dad found his voice then. It's not that simple, Sarah. It's not what you think. Then explain it to me, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when inside I was screaming. Explain to me how I have a biological father named Anthony Martinelli living in Phoenix who apparently doesn't even know I exist. Explain to me why I've spent my entire life feeling like I didn't belong in this family when you knew exactly why. Mom started crying then, these quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks without any sound. We wanted to tell you, she whispered. We talked about it so many times over the years, but it never seemed like the right time. And then so much time had passed, and we were scared. Scared of what? I interrupted, my carefully controlled composure finally cracking. Scared that I'd want to know my real father? Scared that I'd find out my mother had an affair? What exactly were you protecting me from? We were protecting our family, Dad said quietly, and something in his voice stopped my anger cold. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, deflated in a way that made my chest hurt despite everything. We were protecting you and us, and what we built together. Tell me what happened, I demanded. Tell me the truth. All of it. They looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that long-married couples can have with just their eyes. Finally, Mom took a shaky breath and started talking. I met Anthony at a conference in Chicago, she said, not meeting my eyes. Your father and I were going through a rough patch. We'd been trying to have a baby for 3 years, and the doctors had told us it probably wasn't going to happen. We were both dealing with that disappointment differently, and we'd grown apart. Dad took over the story. I was working too much, drinking too much, not being the husband Linda deserved. She was depressed about the fertility issues, and I wasn't helping. I was making everything worse. Anthony was kind to me, Mom continued. He listened when I talked about wanting children, about feeling like a failure as a woman. He was going through a divorce, and we both needed someone who understood disappointment. It was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, but for a few weeks he made me feel like maybe I wasn't broken. And then I found out I was pregnant, she whispered. After 3 years of doctors telling us it wasn't possible, suddenly it was happening. But the timing, I knew there was a chance the baby wasn't Robert's. I looked at Dad, trying to understand his part in this story, and you knew from the beginning. He nodded slowly. Linda told me everything as soon as she realized she was pregnant. We could have gotten divorced. We could have tried to figure out paternity right then. But instead, we made a choice. What choice? We chose to be a family, Mom said. Robert said it didn't matter who the biological father was. If I wanted to have this baby, he wanted to raise it as his own. We agreed that we'd never tell anyone the truth, that we'd be your parents in every way that mattered. And Anthony never knew, Dad said firmly. Linda ended things with him before she even knew she was pregnant. He went back to Arizona, finalized his divorce, remarried someone else. As far as he knows, they had a brief relationship that ended, and that was it. I stared at them, trying to process this information. In one way, their story was almost romantic, to people choosing love and commitment over biological technicalities, deciding to build a family regardless of genetics. But in another way, it was a massive betrayal of my right to know my own origins. You should have told me, I said finally. Maybe not when I was 5, but at some point. You should have given me the choice about whether I wanted to know Anthony, whether I wanted that relationship in my life. We were scared of losing you, Mom whispered. And that's when I realized that this conversation wasn't just going to change my relationship with my parents. It was going to change everything about how our family moved forward. The months that followed that confrontation were the hardest our family had ever endured. There were tears, arguments, long periods where we barely spoke to each other. I was angry at the deception. They were defensive about choices they'd made before I was even born. And none of us really knew how to navigate this new reality where our family's foundation had been shaken to its core. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Martinez, who specialized in family trauma and identity issues. She helped me understand that my anger wasn't really about the affair, or even about Anthony Martinelli. It was about autonomy. For 28 years, my parents had made decisions about my identity without my input. They'd watched me struggle with questions about my appearance, my personality, my sense of belonging, and they'd chosen their comfort over my right to know the truth about myself. but therapy also helped me see their perspective. They were 22 years old when I was born, barely more than kids themselves. They'd made a choice based on love and fear, trying to hold their marriage together while giving me a stable family. It wasn't malicious, it was just human. Flawed, complicated, but ultimately human. The hardest part was deciding what to do about Anthony. I had his contact information now, thanks to the DNA site. I could reach out, introduce myself, turn his world upside down, the same way mine had been turned upside down. Right. But did I have that right? Did I want that relationship? And what would it mean for the man who actually raised me if I started building a connection with my biological father? I spent weeks writing and rewriting emails I never sent. You don't know me, but I'm your daughter. Hello, Mr. Martinelli. I recently took a DNA test that indicates you're my biological father. Nothing sounded right. How do you introduce yourself to a parent who doesn't know you exist? Finally, I decided to start smaller. I created a more detailed profile on the DNA site, including some information about myself and my interests. If Anthony was actively using the platform, he'd see that we'd been matched as parent and child. He could make the choice about whether to reach out or not. 3 weeks later, he did. His message was careful, tentative. Hello, Sarah. I received a notification that we're a genetic match as parent and child. I'm not sure if this is accurate. I don't have any children I'm unaware of. Could there be a mistake with the testing? If not, I'd very much like to understand the situation better. Please feel free to contact me if you're comfortable doing so. I stared at that message for 2 days before responding. I finally wrote back. I told him the basics, that I was 28, that I'd grown up believing Robert was my biological father, that a DNA test had revealed the truth. I mentioned that my mother had told me about a brief relationship with someone named Anthony Martinelli in Chicago, around the time I would have been conceived. His response came within hours. Linda. Oh my God. Linda from the marketing conference in 1995. Yes, we had a relationship. It was brief, but meaningful to me at the time. She never told me she was pregnant. Sarah, if you're truly my daughter, then I have missed 28 years of your life, and I am so very sorry. And that's how I started building a relationship with my biological father. Anthony turned out to be everything the genetics had suggested he would be. Warm, curious, adventurous in the same ways I'd always been. He was an architect who specialized in sustainable design, traveled to 43 countries, spoke 3 languages, and had that same restless energy that had always set me apart from my quieter, more homebody parents. Our first phone call lasted 3 hours. Our first video chat left both of us in tears. The resemblance was so strong it was almost eerie. When we finally met in person 6 months later, his wife Rosa welcomed me like I'd been part of their family all along. My half-siblings Marcus and Isabella were thrilled to discover they had an older sister. But building a relationship with Anthony didn't mean abandoning the parents who raised me. That was the most important thing Dr. Martinez helped me understand. Love isn't a zero-sum game. I could have a relationship with my biological father without diminishing what Robert had meant to my life. It took almost a year, but eventually, my parents and I found our way back to each other. The relationship is different. Now there's less blind trust, but there's also more honesty. They've apologized repeatedly for keeping the secret so long, and I've worked to understand why they made the choices they did. Robert and I had the hardest conversation of our lives about 6 months after the revelation. He told me he'd always wondered if the day would come when I'd find out the truth, that he'd lived with the fear of losing me for my entire life. I told him that biology might have given me life, but he'd given me everything else: love, support, guidance, and the foundation that made me who I am today. You're my dad, I told him that day. DNA doesn't change that. Nothing changes that. Today, I have relationships with both men who contributed to making me who I am. Anthony and I email regularly, and I visit Phoenix twice a year. I've gotten to know my half-siblings, learned about my Italian heritage, and finally understood where my wanderlust and artistic tendencies come from. It's added richness to my life.